All right, so this is a review for chapter 36. Test is tomorrow. We're going to start off with 5 terms. Several terms here. First off, George Kennan. This is the author of the containment policy. Comes up with the containment policy published under an anonymous author X in a foreign policy magazine. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. These are American spies that deliver the atomic secret to Stalin. Well, they're American spying on America. Adlai Stevenson. He is a Democrat candidate running against Eisenhower in both 1952 and in 1956. Adlai Stevenson. Post-World War II fears. The Americans feared, many economists and Americans feared that after World War II, America would return to another Great Depression. The Iron Curtain. This is a term that came from Winston Churchill, and it kind of marked this area separating East and West Europe, separating communism and democracy, capitalism and communism. The policy of containment, then back to George Kennan, and it also, you should understand how the policy of containment relates to the war in Korea, and the way in which Stalin and Mao wanted to test this policy, so they encouraged North Korea to test the 38th parallel. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. This was an act put into place to try to check the growing power of labor unions post-World War II. The baby boom. This is a growth of birth rates post-World War II. And the height of the baby boom, it reached its peak in the late 1950s. The United Nations, a couple of questions here about the United Nations. The origin of the the United States and the Soviet Union both were permanent members on the Security Council of the United Nations. Unlike the failed League of Nations, the new United Nations was established in a spirit of cooperation, and it was actually established before World War II's actual end. Also, the earliest and most serious failure of the United Nations involved its inability to control atomic energy, especially the manufacture of weapons. There's post-World War II war crime tribunals. This was both in Japan and Germany. In Germany, Nazism should be destroyed, and high-ranking Nazis should be tried and punished for war crimes. And then also in Japan, post-war Japan had its military leaders tried for war crimes, as in Germany. The Berlin airlift. When the Soviet Union denied the United States, Britain, and France access to Berlin in 1948, President Truman responded with the airlift of supplies to Berlin. The NSC 68, it's the National Security Council 68. This actually was set up in the early 1950s, late 1940s, and it called for a massive increase in military spending. And this massive increase in military spending really influenced the United States economy. Okay, then there's a couple questions involving the Truman Doctrine and a Marshall Plan. So we have the immediate crisis that prompted the announcement of the Truman Doctrine was related to the threat of communism taking over in Greece and Turkey. And under the Truman Doctrine, the United States pledged to support those who were resisting subjugation by communists. And the Marshall Plan then called for substantial financial assistance to help rebuild Western Europe. Question here about the Jewish state of Israel. And President Truman risked American access to Middle Eastern oil when he recognized the new Jewish state of Israel. NATO, we have a American membership in NATO, or North Atlantic Treaty Organization, strengthened the containment of the Soviet Union. It also helped to reintegrate Germany into the European family. It struck a major blow to American isolationists. So isolationists in America did not like this policy, or the NATO membership. So post-war Japan, again, that goes back to the wartime tribunals, war crime tribunals, and so Japan, post-war Japan, tried their military leaders as well. And then we have these two Chinese leaders, so Mao Zedong, and this is a different spelling than the way I used it in the PowerPoint, but this is the nationalist leader Chiang. Chiang and the nationalist government lost the Chinese Civil War to the communist Mao, mainly because Chiang lost the support and confidence of the Chinese people. But remember that the United States does support Chiang. Chiang then retreats to the island of Taiwan. Then we have matching. I've put them up here on the board. Truman is also one of these four. So you have Truman as the Democrat in 1948. You have Dewey as the Republican. Strom Thurmond as a states' rights candidate for president, and Wallace as a progressive candidate. These are four candidates running in 1948. And of course, even though, despite the famous photograph of Truman holding up the newspaper saying Dewey wins, Truman actually won the election in 1948. Truman then introduces his economic policy called the Fair Deal. This kind of is consistent with, first of all, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt comes up with the Square Deal. Then FDR comes up with the New Deal. And then Truman comes up with the Fair Deal. And Douglas MacArthur, President Harry Truman relieved Douglas MacArthur from command of the United Nations troops in Korea when MacArthur began to take issue publicly with presidential policies. So we were talking about Truman questioning, or MacArthur questioning Truman's decision not to drop the atomic bomb in Korea. All right, then we have a map of Europe, and you have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, these 11 countries. Unlike the previous test, you will just have to match those countries with a number that's already on the map. You won't have to know the answer to a question and then find that country. You'll just have to know the country's location. There's a couple questions then here that are from the first part of chapter 36 dealing with the United States economy. So the vast expansion of middle class in a post-World War II economy in an effort to forestall an economic downturn. President Truman created the President's Council on Economic Advisors. He sold war factories and other government installations to private businesses at very low prices. He passed an Employment Act, and he also then passes the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, known as the GI Bill of Rights. All of those things were passed in order by Truman's administration in order to forestall what sometimes occurs in a right after a war. You have a bit of an economic downturn. So those were measures that the Truman administration put into place in order to kind of, again, in order to alleviate many Americans' fears that we would just return to a Great Depression after the war. We have a long economic boom from World War II then to the 1970s was primarily fueled by low energy costs. Very, very cheap fuel was available in a post-World War II economic climate. We then also have, we have much of the prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s rested on the underpinnings of a colossal military budget, huge amounts of government funding for military budgets and the military defense spending. The dramatically reduced number of American farms and farmers in a post-war era was accompanied by spectacular gains in agricultural productivity. So despite the fact that we have fewer farmers, we actually have more agricultural productivity. And then population in the Sun Belt increases dramatically. Since 1945, population in the United States has grown most rapidly in the Sun Belt. A couple of questions here about much of the Sun Belt's new prosperity was based on defense spending, tremendous influx of money from the federal government. And then we have a question here. Several reasons for Americans moving to the suburbs, and we can list these. Home loans guaranteed by the federal government encouraged people to move to the suburbs. Massive amounts of government spending on highways, encouraging people to engage in transportation from the suburbs to their jobs. Tax deductions on interests on payments for a mortgage, so all of a sudden you could deduct that. That encouraged purchasing homes. And then also this idea of a white flight from racial change. There is a lot of people that are moving to these big cities for the jobs. A lot of people are moving from rural agricultural south to find these jobs. And then there's a white flight phenomenon that occurs as well. All right, just a couple more here then. What was the earliest and most serious failure of the United Nations? And this is to control the atomic energy, especially the manufacture of weapons. I think that was mentioned earlier. How did Truman risk American access to Middle Eastern oil supplies? And this was when he actually recognized the new Jewish state of Israel. He risked alienating relationships with the oil-rich countries of that region. And how did the United States' participation in NATO mark a dramatic departure from traditional American foreign policy? And this has to do with our traditional isolationist. So it marked a dramatic departure from Americans' traditional dependence upon isolationists. And we returned to an isolationist model after World War I, but our joining both NATO and the United Nations marks kind of a shift from this. So that concludes the review. So you have a couple of definitions. You have the map, and then you have the rest that are multiple choice.